Welcome to Fact Fragment. I'm your AI host. The team here specifically chose me for this deep dive, hoping my delivery offers clarity, precision, and, well, keeps you engaged.
And we've got quite a topic today. We're diving into the economic impact of tariffs, specifically focusing on recent U.S. trade policies, say from around 2010 up to 2025. Think of it as a focused look at what happens when these policies get put into action.
Exactly. We've done the digging for you, going through peer-reviewed studies, government reports, economic analyses. Quite a stack of material, actually.
The goal really is to pull out the core insights, the main takeaways about how these tariffs have shaped the U.S. economy over this period.
So let's start with the basics. What is a tariff, fundamentally?
Right. Simply put, it's a tax levied on goods coming into a country. The immediate effect is that imported goods become more expensive compared to, the stuff made domestically.
And there are different types, correct?
Yes, mainly two kinds. You've got specific tariffs, that's a fixed charge per unit, like say $1 on every imported t-shirt. Then there are ad valorem tariffs, which are probably more common now, and that's a percentage of the imported goods value, maybe 15% on the value of an imported car, for example.
Okay. And historically, the U.S. has used tariffs for a while.
Oh, absolutely. Way back, they were a primary source of government revenue. Then, as U.S. industry developed, they became a tool for protection, shielding those growing businesses from foreign competition.
But that changed after World War II.
It did, yeah. There was a big global move towards trade liberalization, lowering tariffs, through agreements like GATT and later the WTO. But, and this is the interesting part for our discussion, recently, particularly in the U.S., we've seen a definite resurgence in their use.
Which brings us to the core of this deep dive. What are the intended effects of tariffs? And maybe more importantly, what are the actual, sometimes unintended consequences we've seen, especially in the U.S. context? That's what we're aiming to unpack from the sources.
Exactly. That's the mission.
All right. So why would a government even implement tariffs? What are the arguments for them?
Well, one of the classic arguments is protecting infant industries. The idea is you shield new, developing domestic industries from strong foreign competitors until they're sort of ready to stand on their own feet.
Give them a chance to grow, essentially. Makes sense. What else?
Another big one is countering what are seen as unfair trade practices. Things like dumping, selling goods below cost, or maybe illegal subsidies that other governments give their producers. Tariffs can be framed as a tool to, level the playing field.
And national security often comes up in these discussions.
Definitely. Protecting industries deemed vital for national defense. The logic is you don't want to be dependent on foreign sources for critical materials or technologies, especially in a crisis.
Okay. Then there's the whole issue of trade deficits. How are tariffs supposed to address that?
The thinking there is, if imports become more expensive, people will buy more domestic goods instead. Fewer imports, maybe more exports if other countries don't retaliate, and theoretically, the trade deficit shrinks.
And jobs. That's always a central argument, preserving domestic employment.
Right. If people buy more American-made goods because imports are pricier, the theory goes American companies will need to produce more and potentially hire more workers. And while less of a factor now for big economies like the U.S., let's not forget tariffs do generate some government revenue.
Okay, so those are the main justifications often put forward. But what does the economic theory and, more importantly, the actual evidence tell us about what happens when tariffs are imposed? What are the impacts?
Well, let's start with the producers, the domestic companies. For them, tariffs on competing imports can look like good news initially. Less foreign competition might mean they can raise prices, maybe gain market share.
And potentially invest more or hire more people.
Potentially, yes. That's the hope. But there's a flip side. Less competition can also mean less pressure to innovate or become more efficient. So you might end up protecting firms that aren't actually very productive, which isn't great for the economy overall in the long run.
Right. And what about the impact on consumers? Us.
Generally, consumers tend to face higher prices, not just on the imported goods themselves, but often on the competing domestic goods too, because, well, there's less competitive pressure keeping prices down.
So less purchasing power.
Exactly. Your money doesn't go as far. Plus, you might find there's less variety of goods available on the shelves. And the research really bears this out.
You mentioned some specific studies earlier.
Yeah, Fackelbaum and his colleagues in 2020, their work suggested U.S. consumers faced something like a $1.4 billion per month hit to their real income by the end of 2018 because of the tariffs.
Wow, per month.
Per month. And Amidi, Redding, and Weinstein in 2019 found that for the tariffs they studied, the cost was almost entirely passed through to U.S. domestic prices. meaning U.S. consumers and businesses importing goods were footing the bill, not the foreign exporters.
So the idea that the exporting country pays the tariff doesn't always hold up in reality.
Often it doesn't, especially for a large economy like the U.S. that imports a lot. The evidence suggests the burden falls primarily domestically.
Okay, so producers might get some protection, but consumers likely pay more. What about the overall economy? Efficiency?
Tariffs generally create what economists call deadweight losses. It's a bit jargony, but basically they distort decisions. Some consumption that would have happened doesn't because prices are too high. Some domestic production happens that's less efficient than importing would have been. That gap, that lost value, is the deadweight loss. It makes the overall economic pie smaller.
Interesting. And you mentioned something about terms of trade for large economies.
Right. Theoretically, a country that's a huge buyer of a certain good might be able to use a tariff to force the foreign sellers to lower their pre-tariff price. If that happens, the country's terms of trade improve. They're getting imports cheaper relative to their exports.
But there's a catch.
A big one. Retaliation. If other countries slap tariffs on your exports in response, any potential terms of trade gain usually disappears pretty fast, and then you're just in a situation where trade is reduced and everyone's likely worse off.
And what about U.S. businesses that use imported goods in their own production, like parts or materials?
That's a crucial piece. Tariffs on these intermediate inputs raise costs for domestic manufacturers. Think about steel tariffs making cars or washing machines more expensive to produce here.
Which makes them less competitive.
Exactly. Less competitive both at home and in export markets. It can also hinder access to maybe better quality or more advanced inputs available only from abroad, which can impact productivity and innovation down the line.
Okay, that paints a clearer picture of the general effects. Let's zoom in on the recent U.S. experience, say 2018 to 2025. What did the empirical studies find specifically about those tariffs?
Well, we touched on Amiti et al. And Fegelbaum et al., showing consumers bore the cost. Another really interesting one was by Flyan, Hordasu, and Tintelnot in 2020, looking at washing machine tariffs.
What did they find?
They found prices for washing machines jumped by about 12%. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just imported washers. Domestic manufacturers raised their prices by almost the same amount.
So the tariff protection allowed domestic firms to increase prices too.
Precisely. They called it protection building protection.
Yeah.
It shows how the price effects can spread beyond just the taxed imports.
That's a significant ripple effect. What else did the research highlight?
Uncertainty. Several studies, like Crowley et al. In 2018 and Handley-Lamont in 2017, stressed how the uncertainty surrounding trade policy, not knowing if or when tariffs might hit, really puts a damper on business decisions.
So,
Businesses delay investment. They hold back on expanding trade relationships. It just creates this hesitation that can slow down economic activity even before any tariffs are actually implemented. Just the threat can be damaging.
got it. But was the pass-through of tariff costs to consumers always 100%?
Not always. There was a study by Cavallo and his team in 2021 suggesting that in some sectors, U.S. importing firms actually absorb some of the cost, maybe around 30%, by reducing their own profit margins.
Ah, so it wasn't uniform across all industries.
Right. It suggests there's some variation depending on market structure, how competitive the sector is, things like that. So while consumers generally paid more, the exact amount could differ. It adds a bit of nuance.
Okay, that helps understand the recent impacts. Now, maybe quickly place this recent period in historical context. You said tariffs were huge in the 19th century.
Yeah, for much of the 1800s, they were the main source of federal revenue. And alongside that, a tool for industrial protectionism, trying to help American manufacturing get established.
Then came Smoot-Hawley in 1930. That one has a bad reputation.
A very bad reputation. Passed during the Great Depression, it raised tariffs dramatically on thousands of items. The consensus now is that it was counterproductive, provoked widespread retaliation from other countries, choked off international trade, and likely deepened the Depression. It's often cited as a cautionary tale.
And then the pendulum swung the other way after World War II.
Exactly. The post-war era saw the creation of GATT, leading eventually to the WTO, and a general trend towards multilateral trade liberalization. Average U.S. tariffs dropped significantly from, peaks of over 20% down to below 5% by the early 2000s. Bown and Irwin documented this trend well.
So decades of lowering barriers and then this sharp shift back towards protectionism starting around 2018. What were the key policy moves in the U.S. during that 2018-2025 period?
It started quite notably in 2018 with the Section 232 tariffs, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum justified on national security grounds.
Right, I remember that.
Then came the Section 301 tariffs, specifically targeting China. These were rolled out in phases, eventually covering about $370 billion worth of Chinese goods, with rates mostly between 7.5% and 25%.
And those escalated further.
Dramatically so. By April 2025, the administration announced increases pushing tariffs on virtually all imports from China, with some rates going as high as, believe it or not, 145%.
145%, that's huge.
Massive. Beyond China, there were also targeted actions tariffs on solar panels, washing machines, some European goods related to an aircraft subsidy dispute. And then in 2025, things broadened further.
How so?
New 25% tariffs were imposed on imports from Canada and Mexico, though with some exemptions under the USMCA agreement and for energy. And perhaps most significantly, an announcement in April 2025 of a plan for a minimum 10% tariff on imports from most countries, plus potential higher reciprocal tariffs targeting countries with large trade surpluses with the U.S.
Wow. So a really widespread application of tariffs by 2025. Let's dig into the specific economic impacts of these policies during that 2018-2025 window. What were the direct effects on prices and trade flows?
Okay, on prices, as we discussed, the bulk of the evidence, like the Amiti study, points to U.S. consumers and businesses paying the cost. While Cavallo found some absorption by firms, the general story was higher prices. For specific inputs like steel and aluminum, studies like Flan and Pierce confirmed downstream manufacturers faced higher costs.
Did imports actually drop significantly overall?
Imports from the targeted countries, especially China, did fall, but it wasn't necessarily replaced by U.S. production. A lot of research, like NACETA's in 2019, showed significant trade diversion. Basically, imports shifted. Instead of buying from China, U.S. firms started buying from Vietnam, Mexico, or other countries not hit by the tariffs.
So the goods still came in, just from different places.
Largely, yes. Bown and Zhang found overall U.S. imports didn't fall nearly as much as the tariffs might have implied. And we saw evidence of companies trying to reroute supply chains, maybe shipping Chinese goods through a third country to avoid the direct tariff. It shows how interconnected and adaptable global supply chains are, but also how disruptive tariffs can be.
What about jobs and production here in the U.S.? Was there a boost in the protected sectors?
It's really mixed. Some studies found modest gains in employment or output in sectors like steel or aluminum that got direct protection. But, and this is crucial, these gains often seem to be offset, or even more than offset, by losses in industries that use those protected inputs.
Because their costs went up.
Exactly. Flan and Pierce, for instance, estimated that the net effect of the steel and aluminum tariffs was actually a reduction in overall U.S. manufacturing employment, something like 1.4%. While the Commerce Department reported higher capacity use in aluminum, industries like beverage cans or auto manufacturing faced higher metal costs, potentially hurting their jobs and competitiveness.
So the net effect on jobs seems negative, or at best, neutral, despite the protectionist aims.
Okay, so direct effects, higher prices, trade diversion, maybe a net drag on manufacturing jobs. What about the broader macroeconomic picture? GDP, inflation.
Most estimates for the 2018-2022 tariffs suggest a negative impact on U.S. GDP, maybe in the range of Medigo 0.2% to Niagara 0.5%. Not huge percentages, but still a drag. Looking at the 2025 situation with the much broader tariffs, projections suggested a more significant potential slowdown, maybe even pushing towards contraction depending on retaliation and other factors.
Inflation. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated the earlier tariffs added about 0.3 percentage points to CPI inflation in 2018-19. Concentrated in certain goods, of course. By March 2025, year-over-year CPI was running at 2.4%, and with the new broader tariffs kicking in, significant price hikes were projected for things like clothes, food, cars, stuff consumers really notice.
What about investment? Did the policy uncertainty affect business spending?
Yes, there's evidence it did. Caldara and his colleagues estimated in 2020 that trade policy uncertainty depressed business investment by around 1.5% during 2018-19. Businesses just become more cautious about big spending plans when the trade rules seem unstable.
Makes sense. And were these impacts felt evenly across the U.S., or did they hit certain regions or groups harder?
Definitely not even. The Fegelbaum study we mentioned found something quite striking. The retaliatory tariffs from other countries, particularly on agricultural goods like soybeans, disproportionately harmed workers in counties that had voted heavily Republican in the preceding election.
So the political supporters of the administration imposing the tariffs were hit hard by the blowback.
Ironically, yes, in many cases. Agricultural states suffered significantly. And in terms of income groups, the research, like Amiti's, points to a regressive impact. Because lower-income households spend a larger share of their budget on traded goods, like clothing, food, basic manufactured items, the price increases from tariffs hit their real incomes proportionally harder.
That highlights some really complex distributional effects. Okay, stepping back again. How effective were these tariffs at achieving their stated goals? Did they work as intended?
Well, let's look. Reducing the trade deficit. The deficit with China did shrink initially, but the overall U.S. trade deficit actually grew. The China reduction seemed mostly due to trade diversion, not a fundamental shift.
What about addressing unfair trade practices?
The Phase 1 deal with China included some commitments on intellectual property and tech transfer, but assessing the actual implementation and enforcement of those has been really difficult. Progress seems limited, or at least very hard to verify.
Protecting strategic industries like steel.
We saw capacity utilization go up, yes,
Hmm.
maybe some limited reshoring, but as we discussed, that came at a significant cost to downstream industries using steel and aluminum. So a very mixed outcome there.
And boosting manufacturing employment overall.
Manufacturing jobs did grow for a period before COVID, but isolating the specific impact of tariffs versus the broader economic cycle is tough. And as Flane and Pierce found, the net effect within manufacturing might have even been negative due to the input cost effects. So hard to claim clear success there.
So achieving the goals seems questionable at best and often came with downsides. Let's summarize those downsides, the unintended consequences.
Big ones. Retaliation was major other countries hitting about $121 billion of U.S. exports, often targeting politically sensitive agricultural and manufactured goods. Supply chain disruption was another companies scrambling to find new suppliers or absorb higher costs, causing real headaches.
And the policy uncertainty we talked about.
Absolutely. That depressed investment and complicated long-term planning. Plus, some U.S. tariff actions were challenged and even ruled against at the World Trade Organization, potentially undermining the international trading system.
It sounds like cost-benefit analyses probably didn't lean in favor of the tariffs.
Generally, no. The studies we've cited, Amidi's $1.4 billion monthly income loss, the Fed's findings on reduced manufacturing employment and output, Huffbauer and Young's estimate of a staggering $900,000 cost per steel job saved, they all point towards the economic costs outweighing the benefits. The burden on consumers and other industries seems to have been larger than the gains for the protected sectors.
Given this body of evidence, what do the experts, the researchers studying this, tend to recommend regarding tariff policy?
The consensus leans towards a much more strategic, targeted approach. If tariffs are used, they should ideally be based on clear evidence, maybe internationally coordinated, used as leverage with specific goals and exit plans, and genuinely focused on national security when that's the claim, not just broad, sweeping actions.
And should tariffs be used in isolation?
No, that's another key point. They should be paired with complementary policies. Things like adjustment assistance for workers and communities hurt by trade shifts, investments in retraining and R&D, maybe strategic industrial policies focused on innovation, not just protection.
What about the process itself? Any recommendations there?
Yeah, calls for more institutional checks and balances. Things like greater congressional oversight, requiring thorough impact assessments before tariffs are imposed, regular reviews or sunset clauses, and better coordination with overall economic strategy.
And engagement with other countries.
Absolutely essential. Continued work within the WTO, exploring new multilateral agreements, bilateral negotiations on specific issues, recognizing that in a globalized world, cooperation is generally more productive than unilateral actions that invite retaliation.
Okay, so just to quickly recap the main drawbacks and negatives we've identified from this period.
Sure, tariffs generally lead to welfare losses that deadweight cost. They reduce competition, potentially slowing innovation. They provoke retaliation, hurting export industries. They raise the cost of living, hitting lower-income households harder, a regressive impact. They disrupt supply chains. They risk escalating into broader trade wars, and they can even cause currency effects that harm exporters further. The broad 2025 tariffs, based on this evidence, were projected to significantly worsen many of these issues, slowing GDP, pushing up prices, and likely leading to net job losses.
All right, so bringing this deep dive to a close, if you had to distill the key lesson from examining the economic impact of U.S. tariffs between, say, 2010 and 2025, what would it be?
I'd say the overwhelming message from the evidence is that while tariffs might seem like a simple tool with historical precedent, their recent application, particularly by the U.S., highlights very significant economic costs and complex, often negative unintended consequences. These frequently seem to outweigh the intended benefit.
And the burden falls where?
primarily on domestic consumers and businesses, through higher prices and disrupted supply chains, plus the ever-present risk of retaliation hitting U.S. exporters and escalating global trade tensions.
That's a powerful summary, definitely food for thought. And perhaps a final question for our listeners to ponder. Given this complex reality and the deep interconnectedness of the modern global economy, how can nations effectively balance that understandable desire to protect domestic interests with the very real broader benefits that come from international trade and cooperation?
That really is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? Finding that balance is incredibly challenging.
Indeed. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today here on Fact Fragment. A big thank you for joining us. If you found this useful, please do consider liking and subscribing to Fact Fragment. We'll be back soon with another exploration. Stay tuned.